Great. Good morning, everyone. This is the June 30th meeting of the Long Range Development Team Oversight Committee. And may I have a roll call, please?
Yes, we have Chair Friedman.
Here.
Councilmember Gutierrez. Here. And Councilmember Jordan.
Good morning.
Good morning. We are all here. So next we'll move on to public comment. Are there any items on the that members of the public wish to speak to that are not on the agenda but under the purview of this committee? If so, please raise your hand in the app. And Ms. Walters, do you see anybody with public comment?
I do not, Chair Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you. I will close public comment. And now we will move on to item B, the approval of the minutes from April 19th. Have my colleagues had a chance to review the minutes? And if so, is there a motion to approve the minutes or any questions or comments?
I would like to move them to pass the minutes, please.
Motion's been made, seconded by Councilmember Jordan. Any further discussion? Any public comment on that item? Hearing none, I'll close public comment. May I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan.
Yes.
Chair Friedman.
Yes. Thank you. Past the minutes are there, and we already did public comment. And so we're on to agenda item 3 for our main topic today. But in speaking with staff yesterday, we're going to do a slight modification to the order of the agenda. And we're going to have the discussion of public noticing for development projects come up first in the presentation, and then we'll go into the presentation. It flows a little better for the discussion we're going to have today. So with that, I will turn it over to staff for the presentation.
Good morning, Chair Friedman and members of the committee. I'm Rebecca Bjork. I'm the acting community development director. And today with me, I have with me Tina Dye and Renee Brook, and then various other staff here to answer any questions you may have. Next slide, please. So again, for those who may be watching, the purpose of this committee, it's a council-appointed committee that has been asked to look at advise the land development team staff and oversee implementation of process improvements related to issues recommended by the Novak Consulting Group and other related issues. Today, you have a fairly significant agenda. Last meeting, we looked backwards at what we had done to date, and today we are starting to look forward at what's coming up for the coming year. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to staff for the presentation. Ms. Dye is up first. Next slide, please. And next slide. And I will invite Ms. Dye to come on and begin the staff presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Friedman and committee members. My name is Tina Dye. I'm the building official for the city. And this morning I'd like to present a few of the recent changes we've made in the Department for Process Improvements. So first, we have added a frequently asked questions section to our webpage. The questions are categorized into 3 sections for convenience, for questions regarding plan review, or inspection and code enforcement, and records and archives. So the public can go directly to the website and find answers to common questions, such as how far in advance do I need to schedule an inspection, or how can I look at my property records, or how many sets of plans do I need to submit for my particular project. And they can do this without interacting with staff, so they don't have to wait for an email or a return call. The other update from this slide is we've added 2 new on-demand permit options, and those are for underground gas service and water service. And those are scheduled to go live next week. Just as a reminder, we currently provide on-demand permit types for water heater or furnace or electrical panel changeouts, and for small residential photovoltaic systems. Next slide, please. And this slide shows our changes to our fee descriptions. This is important. We get a lot of questions regarding fees from what customers see on the receipts. And so currently when an applicant submits an application online, they are charged a application fee, which is actually a percentage of the plan review fee. And when we move to collection of full plan review fees at the time of submittal, they will see building and safety plan check fee instead of building permit fee adjusted. And the second change is we are adding a line item just for the next couple of months for clarity until we start collecting full plan review fee. And this fee line item will be called application fee refund. Currently, it says building permit fee adjusted. So it brings up a lot of questions. And we're also making some changes to our fee schedule effective September 1st. And for clarity, currently it says permit fee and plan review fee. And we want to change that to inspection fee and plan review fee so that the customer sees on their permit exactly what they're paying for. And if compared to the fee schedule, it will match. And that's all I have for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dye. And so now we'll turn it over to Renee Brooke for the beginning of our presentation. Are there any questions? I saw Councilmember Jordan, your screen popped on before we go into the.
Sorry, I didn't know if we were going to pop them up. Most of that is kind of French to me, but I'm assuming it's good French. But one of the things we talked about, Renee, come on back. One of the things we talked about was at some point early in the submittal, we had talked about knowing kind of what the ballpark of the fees would be early on. I can't read that any of that had anything to do with that, but are we still on track to try and do that also?
I think Committee Member Jordan, yeah, if Ms. Dye could answer that question. I believe there have been efforts made to help that along with customers.
You're on mute, Ms. Dye.
Sorry.
Okay.
Committee Member Jordan, yes, we are still on track for fee estimates. I believe that's what you're referring to. So an applicant can call in and get an idea, a ballpark figure of what their permit fees will be.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Good question and good memory, Mr. Jordan. It's an important issue. So I'll turn it back over to Ms. Brooke for the presentation on public noticing. And just as background, this issue had come up at a council meeting a week ago on an item, and we wanted to, the council gave direction to kind of look at our public noticing and how we might be able to improve it for projects, especially those that are appealed on occasion to council, the types of projects. So we decided to refer it to this committee, and since we have our meeting this week, we're able to put it on the agenda and turn over to you, Ms. Brooke. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair Friedman. And that's a great introduction, because initially, as we were setting up the presentation for today's committee meeting, the primary focus is to walk through our work plan on some of the longer term process improvements, one of which does involve noticing when and how the public receives notice, becomes aware about a project, how they stay involved, and then those that unfortunately ultimately end up in appeal to City Council. That is all part of making process improvements. So we thought it would be important to take some time today to provide the committee with some background information on our current public noticing practices, and then talk about some opportunities for where we might modify that going forward. And then you'll see that fold into the second part of the presentation today about streamlining project review and how potentially public noticing can help that. Even additional public noticing could help projects through the process more smoothly. So I'll just dive right in here. I wanted to provide a little bit of background. So the next few slides will build on each other. I wanted to start with just the foundation of where public noticing requirements come from for us. They are set by the California Government Code as a minimum. So this right here is the state law requirements for these 5 types of development projects, legislative actions that require some type of notice to the public. So not too many projects, really, if you rely just on state law. Pretty high level, very complex types of projects. The city notices many more projects than just these, and I'll talk about that in a few more slides, but just want you to understand what's set out in the government code. And then continuing with just the state law, for these projects, the state law requires that at least 10 days prior to the hearing, we send a mailed notice to the owner of the project site, to the owners within 300 feet of the project. If that amounts to more than 1,000 people, then we need to place a display ad in a local publication notifying a much broader, obviously much broader audience than we can address through just mailed noticing. So the display ad takes the place of the mailed notice in that case. We also send a mailed notice to anyone who files a written request to receive one. And then we place a legal ad in the local newspaper just announcing that a public hearing is happening. And that happens for all of our public hearings. So that's the state law. Also, the state law requires that a public notice shall include at least these pieces of information: the date, time, and place of the hearing, the identity of the hearing body, a general explanation of the matter to be discussed, and then a general description of the location of the site or the properties involved in the hearing. So then, building off of that, we go above and beyond the state law minimum requirements. So we do all of that, and at least 10 days prior to the hearing, we mail notice to tenants within 300 feet of the project. The state law only requires that we notify property owners, but City Council gave us direction several years ago to also notify tenants, occupants, whether it's residential or commercial tenants within 300 feet of the project. We also require, for those projects that require a public notice, that they post that yellow notice of development sign on the site. It's supposed to be within just several feet of the street frontage and very visible to people walking by, so that provides notice to those people who might not live or have a business within 300 feet of the site, but they happen to walk around the neighborhood and they might be made aware of a project that way. Also, for certain AUD projects, the larger projects with 5 or more units, renderings of the project concept must be posted on the site so that the public gets a sense of the size and scale and the look of the project that's proposed on the site. And then for certain single unit residential projects that are subject to notice and are being reviewed by the Single Family Design Board, the applicant is required to hand deliver a notice talking about the development that they're proposing to their 10 closest neighbors. And that's really the intent of that, is for people to get together and talk about the project and answer questions and concerns. And so hopefully some of those, very, neighborly type questions or any privacy concerns can be addressed one-on-one and not become a major topic of the public hearing itself. In addition to that, so we send the mailed notice to those property owners and tenants within 300 feet, 10 days prior to the hearing. And then after that first hearing, 3 days prior to every subsequent hearing, we will send a meeting agenda to anybody who's asked to be added as an interested party for that project. And then I wanted to just very quickly familiarize you with the types of projects that, we'll see how quickly I can pull this up. Okay, wanted to just, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but it's available and I can provide it to you at another time, because we will have more public hearings and discussions about the types of projects that get a notice. But to give you a sense, within our planning application guide, we have a list of all the types of development projects that require public notice. And just very briefly summarizing them, it's any type of project that requires planning commission or staff hearing officer decision. Those all get a public notice. And then in terms of design review, it's the type of project like a new commercial building, a new multi-unit building, or a major addition to one of those buildings. In single family zones, it's second story additions, grading, significant lighting projects. Those types of projects generally summarized as they might be of general interest to the neighborhood, or there might be impacts that we should disclose to interested parties or neighbors by giving them advance notice that this type of project is going through the discretionary process. So not every development project requires a notice. And so that's important as we begin to talk about, excuse me, I just need to switch back to the slide. Just a moment. I had a little bit of an issue with this earlier, so I'm hoping I can pull this back up. There we go. Okay, so just want to give you a general idea of the types of projects that require a mailed notice, and to make it clear that not every development project going through staff's review and even through the discretionary review requires a notice. And then building from that, it's good to talk about the timing of when these notices go out to property owners and tenants and interested parties. So our practice has been that the mailed notice goes out to owners and tenants within 300 feet of the site 10 days prior to the first public hearing. And so it's important that that notice go out to people at the earliest possible time, so that if there's concerns with the project design, that the ABR, HLC, or Planning Commission can be made aware of that, the applicant can be made aware of that early on in the process and take that into consideration when they're giving feedback to the applicant. That mailed notice would not go out again unless there were significant changes to the project. But there is a notice at every discretionary hearing, and that is, say a project requires both Planning Commission and HLC, that mailed notice would go out prior to the Planning Commission and prior to the first HLC hearing. From then on, someone would need to ask to be added as an interested party to the project. And that notification language is provided both on the notice and the meeting agenda to alert people that if you want to continue to stay involved and informed about subsequent hearings on this project, you need to ask staff to be added as an interested party, and then we'll send out via email or US mail the meeting agenda 3 days prior to that hearing. People have other ways that they can stay involved too. Some people subscribe to receive every ABR agenda, and so then if they're just interested in what the ABR is reviewing, they can do that. This is a little bit more targeted so that we're only sending out agendas to those folks who are interested in just one project. They might not want to know about everything that the ABR is reviewing. And then just a little visual here in case it helps kind of sink in for people. Our process, this is very simplified, but just a flow chart here. If you see the project submitted over here, staff reviews it. Once we've found that it's at least reasonably developed enough to go to a public hearing, then we will send out this mailed notice. And the applicant is required to post this yellow notice of development sign at least 10 days prior to the hearing. Both of these things occur 10 days prior to the hearing. In this example flow chart here, the first public hearing might be concept review at the Architectural Board of Review. So early on in the project design, probably getting a lot of feedback from the ABR on that. The applicant will go away, take into consideration that feedback, resubmit to staff. And then from there on, if someone has asked to be added as an interested party for this project, we will send them an email with the meeting agenda 3 days prior to every hearing that occurs on that project after that. So that's our current process. As we move forward and talk about process improvements, I think it'd be good for us to consider where we might be able to improve this. And that could be the content of our noticing. Are we providing too much information? Is the really important information hard to find on our notices? And then the timing of the notices. Are we getting people involved at the right point in the project review? Because we found that it's important to get people involved early. So we definitely want them to do a broad noticing at the beginning of the project review. But as council has seen on a couple of occasions, if people don't stay informed and aren't made aware through a broad public noticing that there's a hearing where a decision is going to be made on the project, then interested parties can get involved too late in the project review process. So the timing is important. There's also other forms of public notice. As I said, we email or mail via the postal service, meeting agendas. We could be doing additional mailed notices throughout different stages of the project review. There are the e-bulletins. We could do more noticing on city website if that's a useful place for people to get information. There are on-site postings and in some cases renderings. Story polls are an often debated thing, whether they provide the notice, but do they provide an actual good visual representation of a project, but it is a form of notice. And then also, one thing that we would like to also improve through all of our process improvements and information that we provide on notices and in our public hearings is the announcement of the appeal period, and that we make it really clear that this decision today is appealable, that this is your time. If you have a concern about a project, this is your time to get involved and make your voice heard and ask your questions so that we can hopefully resolve some of these issues with development projects earlier on in the process and maybe ultimately result in less appeals. But if we do have appeals, they're at least occurring at the right point in the project review and not too late when there's not many options to have any influence on the project design at that point. So at this point, I'll pause here. I do have additional slides to go through to talk about the more general process improvements, but I wanted to answer any questions about public noticing at this point.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke, for the presentation on public noticing. And again, this came out of a council meeting, and if we were to make recommendations, I think there are some that we can do to definitely improve the noticing. It actually would have the benefit, I think you stated it very well, that having individuals appeal at the right time is where we're going, and also it saves saves on the back end, so it makes the process more clear and consistent for the project applicants as well as the community that's involved. So with that in mind, I see Councilmember Jordan, you have your light on or your camera on, so you have the floor for questions.
Ms. Brooke, the project applicant pays for the mailing, right?
Yes, Committee Member Jordan, it is one of the fees that they pay.
Okay, and are we getting, so let's pick on a project maybe like De La Vina in the 300-foot circle. How many notices go out, you think, on a mailing like that in a downtown block grid of residential and some commercial?
Great question. It varies widely. If there's condominiums or an apartment building, of course, that would have a lot more addresses to be mailed to. But gosh, if I just took a wild guess, because our blocks are about 450 feet long, it would capture maybe a block and a half. I mean, around, when you draw the full circle radius around 600 feet. So hard
Hundreds?
to quantify.
Well, it's got to be 300. No, I don't know how many. It's got to be 300 feet, but is it hundreds and hundreds or thousands or?
Not usually thousands, but
Okay.
it can be 100.
Okay.
Yeah, if you have an apartment building or condominium development in there.
And we're doing the labor on that though, right? And so is the fee we're collecting a full cost recovery for the labor, the mailing, and the supplies generally?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so it's really just a matter of time, right? So, all right, so I was pretty ready to just jump on, additional mailing. In the example, we're using an additional mailing at the point before the last potential to appeal, the timeliness of that, and I don't know where, you would know better than me where that occurs in other situations too, or if it does. But I'm kind of softening on that and for sympathy of the task. And I'm betting though, if I saw that whole mailed notice, that public hearing notice, the orange one that was on your slide, I'm betting pretty much that lost in there somewhere is a line or two on, if you want to learn more, please sign up here, when really it should be shouting at me that you may not receive another notice, and if you want to stay in the loop, however we would phrase that, here's how you do that. You know, kind of like our disclaimer in big 16-point bold font kind of thing. And so I'm kind of getting a little more agnostic either way on that, on what would be. I see we could accomplish it with more work, more money to the applicant at the right time, but probably for different paths, it would be all messed up in time. Or maybe you could just accomplish that better with a form that really, you know, started out right at the top under the big public notice hearing, you know, some admonition that this may be the only notice you get. And if you want to stay informed and be part of the process and not miss an appeal opportunity, go sign up here, kind of thing, right? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I completely agree with you that we have a lot of information and we try to put on our public notices, and so some of that does get lost. It's there, but yes, I agree. It can be a lot to try to absorb.
And then, you know, one of the other people have opinions I'd like to hear too, but really the only other one that rises to a level of talking about for me is also the story polls. And so I'd just like to hear your thoughts. I'm kind of agnostic there too, because it's generally a group of architects that know what they're doing. I think the perception is certainly that they're harsher rather than easier during the process of review. That it's, you know, it is not a whatever you want goes. It's a slog to go through those sometimes, and giving them the option to be satisfied amongst themselves that the renderings or whatever would replace the story polls is sufficient for them to make their findings is still attractive to me. You know, just using De La Vina as an example, I think I said this last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, that, you know, the protests that we were hearing at the end were already considered by the ABR during the process. I don't think there would have been, you could have started over and the result would have been the same, and they felt that they didn't need story polls to make those findings, that they had adequate information there. So what's kind of your thought on that, one or the other?
That's a great question. And so I'll share a couple of things. So story polls are a great way to notify people that something is happening on a site, because you can see them from sometimes well beyond the neighborhood. But they are expensive. They can be difficult to install depending on what's on the site and really for how long they can stay up, because often there's businesses, you know, life going on the property, and having the story polls there can kind of shut down what's going on the property for a while. They're also static in that they're only showing the project at one point in time. And then I asked myself the question, what's the right time to put up the story polls? Well, might be early, because that's the first time people are being, again, notified of the project. They are not the best tool to visually represent what the project will look like, because unless you build out all the roof forms and the step backs, the articulation that the building has, it's a very gross representation of the building. So, and I think because our design review boards are largely comprised of design professionals, they can review renderings and modelings and plans and can visualize what that will look like without needing to see the polls out on the site. Perhaps there's a particular question that could be answered by putting polls up in a certain part of the site, might be used to determine a particular aspect of the building if someone's struggling with how that's really going to look from the sidewalk. But generally, not the greatest tool to visualize what a project will look like.
I'd agree with that from my experience too, and really, I think story poles are just a nudge, and you could probably accomplish the same thing with a big old sign that says, in Mike Jordan's words, "There's a big old building going here," because really, the input I always hear when people look at a story pole or they wanted to look at a story pole is they just wanted to know that there was a big old building coming in their frame of reference. It really wasn't, that it's this high to that eave and this high to that eave and it goes down over here. They're the same as me. I can't visualize that either, and obviously you don't get the articulation. But so I guess I just throw that out there for discussion. Maybe there's a different opportunity on a size of a building or a size of a building in relation to what's there already. I mean, that's usually the slap in the face is, how can you build 45 foot here? And the answer is, well, it's been zoned that for 100 years to build 45 feet there, but you didn't know it. But maybe there's just a big sign, like a 4x6, 4x8 sign like we put on bigger projects that talks about the contact information, where a rendering could go on that, and that would draw people's attention to it, that maybe they want to pay attention rather than go through the logistics of poles everywhere, poles on top of buildings, poles in businesses that are trying to work. So I don't know. Councilmember Friedman and Gutierrez, I just kind of throwing things against the wall and maybe something will resonate. But thank you for your answers, and I'll get out of the way. Thanks.
Councilmember Jordan, I will say maybe one of the most useful areas for story poles is if you're trying to visualize if a public view might be impacted. That then on the site, you can drive by the site and really see, okay, is this major public view going to be impacted? That you could do in a rendering, but that might be one where it just becomes much more clear. But visualize general mass and scale of a building, yep. Poles are not the best tool.
I agree with you too. I look out the window and down De La Guerra a couple blocks too. That was what, 801 Santa Barbara Street or some 701 Santa Barbara, whatever that was. The two wasn't necessarily a public view, but the transition from a low building there to a pole with a ribbon between it showing you where you're going to lose the views that you had, the mountain views, was very dramatic too. So I'd agree with that too. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Councilmember Gutierrez, if you have any questions, I have a couple myself, but just wanted to check in with you. Hearing none. So I have a couple questions, Ms. Brooke. Kind of following up on Councilmember Jordan on the issue of a second round of mail noticing. While there would be a cost, I think one of the process issues that comes up is you might have the initial public hearing, and it might be what's typical between those hearings. There might be a number of months. I think in this case they were saying it was 9 months. So sometimes do you have public noticing that go from the initial public notice to the project design approval of greater than a year? Is that possible, or what's the time frames we're dealing with between the meetings?
Sure, Chair Friedman. It varies quite a bit, but you're right. A project could, depending on the types of comments it got at the first public hearing, it might be 6 or 9 months before they return for the next hearing, which might either be another concept review or they could try to ask for an action at that next hearing.
So there's an extended amount of time. And then when we go to the project design approval, this is the crux of it, is that's a major decision point. And if the public isn't properly noticed, then it would pass, and then it would come to final design. And this is what happened on 2 projects actually. This project, the De La Vina project, and also this happened on 711 North Milpas, is that the neighbors then tried to appeal the final design approval, thinking that perhaps, and some of them would think that perhaps that the city council could look at all these issues, size, bulk, massing, and it's a really specific issue. So would there be a benefit, even though there would be that initial cost, to allowing the neighbors to, or informing the neighbors early on the major decision point, not every meeting, but the major decision point is, say, project design approval. And would that be a more efficient process, perhaps for the applicant as well?
I think that's a great question. And the only, I don't even want to call it a downside, but here's just something to consider, is that if we did another full round of mailed noticing to the owners and tenants within 300 feet, 10 days prior to that hearing where project design approval might be granted, it would just delay the project getting on that hearing. So it might be 2 to 4 weeks that it takes, just depending on how many projects we have potentially agendized for a meeting. So it could elongate that part of the process, but hopefully if we are getting people's attention at the right point during the project review process, we could ultimately save time from that point on and not get these really uncomfortable appeals really late in the project review.
So there is a trade-off for us to consider there.
Yeah.
There might be a little delay up front and some cost, but it could save time and cost down the line. Just something for us as council to consider. And then the other question, I like the idea of perhaps having an additional sign or some type of noticing on the street that says, this project, you need to, that just stands out at you, that you need to get on it to get on the mailing list. But is there also a way to address the issue of what can be appealed, what specific issues can be appealed with the final design? Because I think there is some confusion that you can file an appeal and we can look at, the council can look at the whole issue. Is there a way to address or make that a better process, one for the public but also the applicant, so that these appeals don't come to council with our hands being tied basically to whether it substantially conforms or not?
Yes, Chair Friedman, I think there's opportunities for us either at the outset of the item on an agenda, if a project is scheduled for project design approval, that we make it really clear. Should it be granted today? Should PDA be granted today? This is appealable. This is your time to, if any concerns you had about mass bulk scale, site configuration were not addressed through our action today, now's your chance to appeal it. And then we could also try to address some of those folks who are getting involved later in the process when a project's scheduled for final approval by saying, and here's the boundaries of what ABR HLC can consider at final approval. We're looking at materials and colors and landscaping and whether or not the massing generally conforms to what we approved 5 months ago. We can try doing that. There's no harm in doing that and just trying to make that information more upfront at the outset of each agenda item where we are anticipating an appealable action.
I think that would be a good idea. One is to let, at the project design approval stage, let the public know, hey, you're at that hearing, reflected in there on the agenda in writing, and perhaps in the minutes. I think that came up as well, that this is you have a 10-day appeal period on this. The other question is perhaps for some more minor projects, but minor projects are maybe not the grand, larger projects, but that are more standard, I should say, that go through the process, but they still have to get the final design. Is there a way that it could actually be done at the staff level or even at the ABR, that grants will come back to the ABR and the ABR decision's final rather than it coming to council? Because most of the time, the final design is going to substantially conform to the project design approval. And so it takes that step out where the public thinks they can appeal it and it comes to council and our hands are tied. But in this way, allowing, I guess, more upfront work to be done at the project design approval and not have that extra appeal. Is that even a possibility? Are there downsides to that?
Chair Friedman, that is something we're discussing, and I'll briefly touch on it in the next section of the presentation about trying to reduce the number of appealable actions that a project has. So it's all part of this, focusing the attention at the right point in the project review so that everyone knows this is your time to make your concerns known. And then, yes, we'd have to work within the charter regarding Architectural Board of Review and Historic Landmarks Commission, as those are charter design review boards. But I think we can get there. We're working with our attorneys on that right now about how we might be able to make the final approval, if not ministerial, it, you know, could be decided by staff at a ministerial level, or could we make it just so minor that it's just a check-in really with the design review board. And you know, so we're exploring a lot of different options there, whether or not final approval actually needs to be a discretionary action if the project was already given project design approval.
Okay, thank you. And then I think that those are my questions. Like I do like the sign, and I do like the noticing, but in particular that this is the major hearing to one, appeal, but also to express your concerns. And the more we can do that up front on the project design approval hearing, that'd be great. So Councilman Jordan, I see you're back on.
Just another question, or Ms. Brooke. So that timeline, so something gets ready, goes through the process, they set it up to get to a hearing for PDA. That's when you had to pause then, if we were going to do a second mailing in this particular example, do your mailing 10 days before or whatever. So that's a couple weeks. So how often does something then go to that PDA hearing and not get PDA approval? And then they set another one 3 weeks from then. And if we were to say you're going to do a mailing at that point, you got to do another mailing at that point, right?
Yes, exactly. And I'd take a wild guess, maybe half of the time.
Really? So yeah. That's a significant amount of time, I think, right? To say we're going to continue to, I mean, if one of the options was to mail it at so focusing attention at the right time, as Eric said, that if that was a right time option for mailing, it potentially leads both into multiple mailings, but also multiple 2-week delays to queue up for that mailing, right?
Right, but I will say when so if a project's gone through 1 or 2 concept reviews maybe, and then it's deemed complete and we're ready to schedule it for project design approval, and say it didn't get it that hearing, most times if it doesn't get it that hearing, it isn't delayed significantly. It might be 2, 4, 6 weeks, and then the applicant's ready to come back. So it's not usually the same length of time that we'll see from the very first concept hearing to project design approval, where people may move, they didn't get their mail, and they're sort of out of the loop. If we did start sending out mail notices before project design approval, I think we'd be able to keep people engaged. We'd have a better chance of keeping people engaged for the next 4 to 6 to 8 weeks when that project gets continued.
Or you could with that notice too, say, go back to my example of that orange piece of paper and screaming it on a headline. You could also scream it on the PDA notice that this is a PDA notice. This would be your last chance to appeal 10 days afterwards. There's a chance that this might be extended, but this will be the last notice you get again, and here's a way to stay. Okay, so there's a way to do that. And then where else do these situations exist in Planning Commission, HLC, or Single Family Design Board, or do they? Is this unique to ABR?
It's not unique to ABR. It's somewhat unique to design review in general. So if a project requires Planning Commission or staff hearing officer action for some type of a land use permit or modification, there's usually just one hearing, one action. It's our design review process, the way that it's been set up for a long time, is multiple visits to design review boards throughout the life of a project. So that's where I think we have the greatest opportunity to tighten up and refine our public noticing.
And with all of those design review processes, regardless of the board or commission, they get that project design approval at one point and still come back later for just the sign off that everything looks okay. That situation exists with HLC, Single Family Design Board, and ABR generally?
Yes, in some
Okay.
cases, when a project is really well developed, when it's presented for project design approval, we can put it on for PDA and final, and the board will take those two actions in one hearing. That's a little less common, but it does happen, and so then
Okay.
that helps eliminate a second discretionary action on it.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Councilmember Jordan. And just to follow up on his point on the noticing, it was a good question if you had multiple PDA hearings. Just doing the first notice, since the timelines are shorter, maybe one mailed notice at the initial PDA hearing, but also stating that this is the final mailed notice you would get for project design, so you wouldn't have to do 2 or 3 mailed notices. So at this point, I'm not seeing any further questions on this, so we can continue on with the presentation. I believe we're going on to the process improvement updates.
Yes, so other process improvements. So at one of your prior meetings, we promised to come back and give you a little bit better idea of how we are scoping some of the process improvements that require municipal code or guideline amendments, because we have been chipping away at those that we can do in an administrative level, but there are many of them, and some of the most impactful ones will require some outreach and public hearings and ultimately council action. So we wanted to just give you a sense of those. And then if you have any initial input for us on the scope of some of these or the direction we think we're headed, it'd be great to hear that today too. So this is just coming from NOVAC report recommendation number 18 to identify changes to the code or other regulations to reduce or eliminate process steps. So through both some of the NOVAC group recommendations and then multiple discussions with staff and what we hear from applicants, we've identified potentially over 50 code or guideline amendments that we could consider as we go through the public hearing process and see where we end up falling out on some of these. But they range from very minor text edits that are just clarifications to the code or the guidelines, and then some of them are pretty major work efforts. We tried to identify those that we thought were fast track, and then we evaluated all of them in terms of effort versus impact. And so right now, we have some staff that are meeting pretty regularly to vet some of these ideas, try to scope them, try to brainstorm them, and then when we're ready, we'll get them out for public review of draft amendments. So just so I'll be referring to these terms through the next few slides. As I said, we tried to evaluate these process improvements based on impact versus effort. And so here's low impact going into high effort, and then versus high impact, and then effort scale from left to right. So where we are focusing in the next year are those things that will have a high impact. So have the most noticeable change in terms of process improvements. We have some that we think are quick wins that we can do within the next 6 to 7 months, and then some that are going to be more major projects. And so just to give you a little sense of a timeline of those, the quick wins, if they do live up to their name and they are actually quick, we hope to be able to get those through public hearings by the end of this year. So we'll have to keep the scope pretty confined in order to actually make them quick. In the meantime, though, we will begin work on some of the more major projects that will take time, more stakeholder outreach, because they're going to be a little more controversial, and then into public hearings through next year, next summer, hopefully. So just to give you an idea of some of the quick wins is to further streamline and clarify the planning application process. So we talked about this a little bit a couple of months ago. We have many services we provide to applicants that we call pre-application services. So they could be planner consultations, they might be pre-application review, they are concept review at the design review boards, and sometimes even at planning commission. We want to make those entirely optional for applicants to take advantage of. If they want to do that, that's great. We're happy to provide that service to give them that early input at a much reduced fee. There are certain applications that are codified to require pre-application review and require concept review. And sometimes applicants don't feel the need for that, but because it's in the code, we have to ask them to do it. So we'd like to just make those 2 pre-application services entirely optional. We think that that could help streamline it for certain projects that don't need that pre-application review and could just get more quickly to a decision. And again, streamline public noticing for certain items. So we've talked about this quite a bit, refining the notices to just the most critical information so people can find very easily, how do I stay involved? What do I need to know about this project? Where is it in the process? Is it now that I need to voice my concern, or is it still very conceptual? Am I too late? We want to make that more clear. And then we have in our government code, we've gone above, or in our municipal code, we've gone above and beyond what the government code requires for display ads. And that, if you'll recall, the government code requires that we do a display ad if we have a project that is impacting potentially more than 1,000 properties, then we need to do a display ad in the newspaper. Display ads are also required for zoning ordinance and general plan amendments if we're affecting the intensity or use of property. So that's pretty much most zoning ordinance amendments are going to trigger this requirement for a display ad. The government code only requires that that ad be placed in the newspaper prior to the planning commission hearing. Our municipal code says we have to do it at every hearing, so it does slow down the ability for us to process ordinance amendments quickly. We would opt to do a display ad if we think that that's a good way to get the word out to a broad range of people. I honestly don't know how many people are informed of ordinance amendments through the legal section of newspapers, but we'd like to consider just pulling back our requirements for display ads to match the state government code and then use them as an option. When we have a really major work effort or ordinance amendment that we think the general community needs to know about, we will outreach in a variety of ways and not rely just on display ads. So we just like the flexibility to process some ordinance amendments more quickly by not having to wait out that 10-day period in between each hearing. We'd also like to consider refining the appeal process. So clarify who has standing to appeal. So we'd like to make it clear both in the code and the guidelines that interested parties who have voiced in some manner their opinion or concern at the lower level hearing body, that they establish some standing to file an appeal to the next hearing body. Also, as you may recall, council recently adopted some ordinance amendments that limited evidence allowed in appeal of any design review action. So you've done that for HLC, ABR, Single Family Design Board, and Sign Committee. We have not yet made those same ordinance amendments for Planning Commission and Staff Hearing Officer decisions, so we'd like to process that amendment package to make that language all consistent. Again, it's just trying to make sure that concerns are expressed at the first opportunity, at the first hearing body, everything is understood, and then if the decision still does not fall the way of the applicant or the concerned party, then they're appealing it to the higher level body, and we know that everything has already been considered and decided one way or the other, and that new information isn't being presented to the next hearing body. And then there's a couple minor zoning ordinance amendments we'd like to make. One that has become a sticking point for many people recently, as we've been experiencing hotter weather, is allowing some minor encroachments of mechanical equipment into private outdoor space, namely air conditioners. And then there's a couple of state laws that have been amended. We need to catch up and amend our zoning ordinance to just mirror that state law language. So we'd like to take this opportunity, if we're going to be making amendments to the zoning ordinance, that we make those as well. And then some of the more major projects, focus and streamlining design review. So this is probably our most significant work effort going forward that will require the greatest outreach and discussion among a wide variety of stakeholders. So one is to consider reducing the triggers for design review. So we have in our municipal code and the city charter certain projects that require some level of design review. We'd like to reevaluate those, working within the limits of the charter, to see if there are some projects that are requiring design review that just are not serving the community in the best way possible. We can maybe focus our design review body's attention on the more significant projects and really allow them to focus on those. Also, we'd like to consider narrowing the scope of review on a project site. So as I mentioned, there are certain projects that require design review because it's a certain size of an addition, or it's a second story addition, or it's an exterior change in El Pueblo Viejo. So that might be one aspect of a project that is triggering design review. We'd like to make it clear that really the focus of that hearing should be on that aspect that triggered design review, and that there isn't scope creep to the rest of the site just because that one aspect is what triggered design review. Also, we've talked about reducing the number of appealable actions. Really what that is meaning to say is focusing the opportunity for appeal at the right point in time in a project review, and not have these late appeals at final approval of a project. Really trying to focus any appeal of a project at the right time. And then this one is sort of technical, shifting minor zoning ordinance exception decision to the Planning Commission or staff hearing officer when possible. So minor zoning ordinance exceptions were created as a new thing in 2017 when we amended the zoning ordinance, and we downgraded from zoning modification to these minor zoning exceptions. We tried to streamline that for some of those modifications that we were regularly approving. We shifted that to design review boards to take action on those rather than the staff hearing officer. But there are times when a project needs both a minor zoning ordinance exception and an action by the staff hearing officer or the Planning Commission. And in those cases, we might as well just have all those actions go to the same body and not have, again, multiple discretionary decisions at different bodies. And then a couple of last bullet points here on major projects is to evaluate the process for priority projects. And that might be either city council priority projects that you have given your approval to fund, you want to pursue certain projects, and they are just unique enough in nature that going through the typical review process is, it just hits a lot of sticking points. So we'd like to consider a process where for certain projects, maybe we form a subcommittee of the design review board and maybe the Planning Commission to try to identify any issues early on. And then it go through the typical review process, because there's not usually a warrant for an exception to that, but there might be in some cases. So we want to just open that discussion up. And then also height findings for community benefit projects. You might recall the police station was one of the more recent examples of this, but it's not the only project. There are private development projects that get caught in this multiple hearings. So in order for certain projects to potentially exceed the 45-foot height limit, they need to be deemed a community benefit project. They are deemed a community benefit project by the City Council, but the Planning Commission actually makes the findings to exceed the 45-foot height limit. So we find these projects going to City Council to be deemed community benefit, then going back to Planning Commission to be considered for the height findings. We'd like to find a way if we can consolidate that into one hearing, or if we can just more objectively define what is a community benefit project, then it might not need that separate first hearing at City Council. And then the big one is consider changes to city noticing procedures and timing. for development projects, which we've talked about pretty extensively. So I won't talk about that one anymore, and I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke, for the presentation. Any questions on this section from my colleagues? Councilmember Jordan.
I'm going to work hard because the comments are right on the front of my brain and not the questions. But so I'm just going back through the pages. The evidentiary thing and not being able to bring up new stuff. We're on. That's. I mean, I agree with that push, but we're on legal good ground there, because isn't truly a council appeal of a design board action supposed to be a reconsideration of what the design board looked at and determined, not a new look at the whole project from a different set of eyes?
Councilmember Jordan, I might not be the best person to advise you on that. I would take a guess at, but I don't want to take a guess at the answer.
Okay, I'm going to hold on that one until I get in front of the right lawyer. And then when you're talking about scope creep, are you still, because we've talked about that and Planning Commission has been all over that, I know, but are we still talking about scope creep in a sense, or kind of a big picture sense that would be look at what the project is, no scope creep unless it's a health safety issue, which you might have a better phrase than that, and also if it wasn't a neighbor's complaint that was, again, something was going on in violation of the current zoning. Is that still your kind of working definition of scope creep?
Councilmember Jordan, I understand your question, and maybe I should clarify, because I do understand your question is about perhaps if there's violations on the property, will our scope of review go beyond initially what the applicant submitted to us for review? That is true, and that is still under discussion with the Planning Commission. The bullet I raised is slightly different. An example might be an applicant wants to come in and install a new pool and maybe a deck, and it's subject to single family design board. And through the review, the single family design board says, well, it's really hard to evaluate this without seeing the whole landscape plan, because we don't know how this relates to that. And so we need you to prepare a landscape plan and continue the hearing and come back. And then the applicant has to hire a landscape designer. And so just trying to put boundaries on that.
Okay, got it. We're talking kind of two different things of the same problem though, right? Okay. And then on the chat you did about city council priority projects. So let's use Milpas as an example, because I'm got my fingers somehow in a couple more where people are talking about a property on Upper State Street or on Haley, and they're talking about maybe we can get to 30% inclusionary, maybe 35. But as you would certainly characterize me, I'm like only smart enough to be dangerous in these roles. And so do you see that as an opportunity when stuff even comes along, not just the stuff that's already in the queue, but that would also be able to have an opportunity when somebody has an interaction like that with a developer, an owner, or an applicant or something, and they're just kind of shooting the stuff and saying, hey, that's kind of a good idea. Hey, I've got this lot, hey, whatever. There would be an opportunity there to put it into, as you described, rather than a two-person memo asking for a development agreement, which just, works, but it's just kind of uncomfortable to do that. Does that make sense?
I think so, and here's a couple of thoughts. So it's been quite a while, but there have been times in the past when we've had a discussion with the developer who has just a pretty new or very different type of project concept that maybe we didn't envision and the code wouldn't quite allow or something. And we might actually present that to City Council under a conceptual review. And it has been a while where, you know, we're going to want to make sure that City Council's on board with this before we spend a bunch of staff time working through the mechanics of how we would actually facilitate this. So that could be one way. An example for what I was presenting in terms of trying to maybe establish a different process is, say, you have an initiative in one part of the general plan or an initiative in one department. Sustainability and resilience has an initiative for so many solar panels on city buildings, but they happen to be in El Pueblo Viejo, and HLC is struggling with our guidelines. Just did not envision solar panels and EPV. So we need to set the course for that project more clearly from the get-go, because otherwise the applicant just kind of bouncing around. So that would be an example where you've got lots of great priorities. What do you do when they don't quite align?
Or another example would be AUDs. In the past, the agony we went through over parking and the process you had to go through to get, we're not going to require any more parking for a neighborhood AUD. That could have just kind of jump started through that initial conversation, council approval, done, move out, right? So same thing. Okay, super. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Thank you, Ms. Brooke. I don't have any questions. I appreciate the presentation. So at this point, not hearing other questions, we can move on to the public workshop.
Okay, so we had mentioned at your last meeting that we wanted to hold a public workshop to gain some feedback so far on our process improvements. Let's see, next slide here. We had talked with you a little bit about this at your last meeting and thought that we might be able to hold this type of a workshop in August of this year, which at that point would have been well, it would have been a year since the Novak report was released, not quite a year since we've been earnestly working on process improvements. But the point of the workshop would be a little bit of education for those folks who might not be aware of what the land development process is and maybe what we've been working on. But largely what we'd want to do is receive input from some recent land development customers. And we're focusing on the recent ones because we do believe there's been a wide variety of analyses of our land development processes, and we know there is room for improvement, and we have made some improvements. We'd really like to get feedback from the customers who have maybe experienced some of those changes to see if we're on the right track. Where are they still seeing sticking points, and how can we refine some of those? So in talking about this a little bit more with some other staff members, we're thinking we'd like to approach this in a multi-pronged way. We do want to probably have some face-to-face conversations with some of our customers just to get that input and have a really, a conversation about it. But we also think it might be an opportunity to have an outward-facing website with some survey questions to where people could answer some of the survey questions over an extended period of time, sort of like how we did the public outreach for the Florida lottery ratio work effort earlier this year, late last year. We could provide some information on the website. People could answer survey questions. We could have some focused conversations with some of our customers. We really want to make sure we get a wide variety of our customers. So we do have some people we interact with almost daily who are very familiar with our process and will be able to give us some input about the aspects of our process that they use regularly. And then we have a lot of customers who might only interact with the city process once or twice. They need to get a permit to re-roof their house, or they're doing a minor addition or remodel, and they've interacted with the land development team maybe once and don't have a frame of reference, but we still want to hear how that experience was for them. We also, on the next slide, I want to talk about some of the things where we think we would want to focus some of the feedback on, and these relate to things that are relevant within the last year or so. So we transitioned to electronic plan submittal and review in April of 2020 with onset of the more major, aspect of the COVID pandemic, and when people went working remotely and we were handling everything electronically. We'd like to hear how that's going. Is there room for improvement? What else can we be doing there? Also, as Ms. Dye mentioned at the outset of this meeting, we are increasing the number of permits that applicants can pull on demand without any interaction with staff. They self-certify certain aspects of their project. If it meets the criteria, they can pull a permit right then. So how's that been working? Also, we'd like to talk to our customers about how the counter functions are working, because prior to the pandemic, we did a lot of email and phone conversations. We took in a lot of applications in over the counter, so it was a lot of face-to-face interaction. We've found that we've been able to help customers pretty well in a remote environment, whether it continues to be email or phone or even just remote meetings like this. So is there the same level of demand for in-person counter interaction, or how might we change counter functions to serve our customers? Because I don't know if we can approach it the same way that we were in February of 2020, because so many things have changed since then. Also, what has been the applicant experience in their working meetings with staff? As they're going through the land development process, there are meetings set up with staff, and since March, April of last year, they've all been remote. Do they like that? Is that something they want us to continue? Would they rather meet in person? So just getting some feedback there, as well as some feedback on our timeliness and permit plan review. And then just continue to discuss where are they seeing challenges in the development process. And again, that's why we'd like to focus on customers that have been through the process in the last year or so, so that they have experienced maybe some of the improvements we've made, but can still give us some feedback on where else we can improve. And I think if I didn't mention, so because we think we want to attack this in a couple different ways through both the website, online survey, and some in-person conversations, it really might take place over the period of July to August, with perhaps some in-person interaction towards the end of August. And then our hope is that at your next meeting in September, we can report back to you what we've heard. And then that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke. Any questions from council members? So I just have a quick question on the workshop. So would this be a series of question surveys, like the time frame we're talking about, over a certain period of time? And then would we come back and have an actual meeting, a public workshop in say the late afternoon or early evening to synthesize all these results, so we'd have an actual meeting, not necessarily this team, but a public workshop meeting that could go over all these results? Or is it just this whole process and then you report back to us?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So maybe I can clarify too, because we're still brainstorming this. So we'd like to hear your input for how to both do outreach and what the format might be. But one way we thought we might narrow the focus of the in-person interaction is if we have this online survey and we get some initial feedback from customers, it might help us scope where are the areas where we need to discuss this further in person. It might just become more clear to us what topics warrant some further discussion in person. That we think might take place in late August, and then report to your committee in September.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Councilmember Jordan.
Ms. Brooke, so I like the multi-pronged approach, but as one of those, did you see like just a big meeting room with whoever wanted to show up and a presentation by staff to customers?
That is one thing we've discussed. That would, if that were to occur, that would probably be the late August meeting. I think we're still trying to strategize how to make that most useful for people, because we wouldn't expect the homeowner who only interacts with the city once every 10 years to probably show up at that kind of a workshop. It's probably going to be more of our regular customers. So probably the conversation at that type of a workshop would be focused more on the complex aspects of our process.
So I'll just sneak in a comment there that in your brainstorming, you might want to invite the HLC, ABR, and Single Family Design Board members to that also. Frequently, I find, definitely these days, those people have a lot more finger on their pulse of what they're really hearing, kind of, out in the backyard about a person complaining that the person won't complain in public necessarily in front of a whole group, but they won't mind giving that anecdotal story as an example of how are we doing, or are we fixing this particular thing. So just leave that with you. So it's a lot of work. I get it. So thanks.
And Councilmember Jordan, just one point to that, if we did reach out to the boards and committees, make sure we're complying with all Brown Act types of issues because if they're speaking and they're all there could be Brown Act issues. So just make sure we're cognizant of that. So at this point, I think that was the presentation. So before we go to comments from my colleagues, I want to open it up to public comment. Ms. Walters, is there any public comment?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. There are no members of the public who have raised their hand and indicated they would like to make a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will close public comment to these items and now open it up to comments from my colleagues to close us out. Councilmember Jordan, I knew you'd have some comments.
I tried to pause for a moment and see if anybody wanted in, but I'll just kind of go through what resonates with me for Ms. Brooke and Ms. Bjork. So on the noticing thing, I think I would like to see some type of better signage out at a site, but I'm uncertain how to get into the weeds on when and how subjective that is, and what's a big project to somebody isn't a big project to somebody else. And I'm thinking like a double large realtor sign on a wooden post kind of thing. So something that's right at the front of property, sticks out, says, in my words, hey, there's a really big building coming here, or hey, there's a bunch of apartments coming here. I don't know how to define that as when it would happen and when it would not happen. So I think my suggestions, I'd like to see staff work on that and come back in September with how that'll work. And then, as I talked about before, on that original notice that goes out in accordance with both the state law and our procedures, I really want something to jump off that notice telling people how to sign up for future notices for the project, and that really jumps out at them early and boldly. And then I think I've convinced myself that I would prefer also that we do another mailing for any of the boards or commissions decisions at the last point of an appeal opportunity, whenever that hearing is, that we take that opportunity to do another mailing then. And also as part of that mailing too, we clearly and boldly make it jump out and say that this may not be the final hearing for that type of approval, but it will be the final mailing. And again, here's how you sign up. That kind of gets me, I think that gets us out of the uncomfortable position we're in, just as an example, on De La Vina, and at least makes people responsibly participate in the process. On your process clarity and consistency stuff, couldn't agree anymore with all of those quick wins and the long-term wins. I think that's a great list there. I fully support that, and I hope that means we can keep working on it. We don't have to work for the semi-annual Planning Commission and council meeting, but we can just continue to go full speed on those type of things. And then again, the only comment I had on the development thing was I think there's a role at some point, and in the public workshop, I think there's a definite role at some point for the people in our boards and commissions who see this tension every week or every couple week of every month, and probably certainly have a better finger on the pulse of any of us here as to what's working better, what's working worse, what suggestions do they have to make things work better. And so I would just encourage them at some point in that process, say when we get to late August, that they're just as an important player in the room as your frequent customers. And that's it for me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I just want to thank staff for this presentation and for all their hard work. I do agree with Mr. Jordan about the sign. If there's any way that we can do that, that would definitely help. Really appreciate how much work you have done in really trying to better the customer service and the community outreach. I just have one little suggestion. I don't know if it's possible. I know it's extra work, but when noticing the neighbors, is there a way that we can maybe have a city staff to notice the neighbors that will be directly affected, like within, how do I explain it? Just from a development project, maybe the neighbors like right across the street, from the side and the back of the project, if there's a city staff that can personally go knock on and just like leave a notice and leave a business card, because we constantly get, you know, the complaint about we never heard about it. And I know this was an awesome presentation, but just to have that personal interaction, and if it's a tenant, then it's a tenant, but just if we can leave something at the door. Mailing is great, but mail always gets lost. So if that's a possibility, that would be great. But just, I just want the neighbors that are going to be like right next to a project or right in front, just a quick little stop by the neighborhood and just letting them know. Last week with the Delavina project, the big issue was, you know, we didn't hear about it. And I know city staff does a lot to get out the word, but it's difficult. So that's just my only suggestion. And I just really appreciate the work that you've done and just the feedback. Every time we give you guys feedback, you always try to implement. So just thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. So staff, I'm sure, took notes and see if that is a possibility for the what I'm hearing from Councilmember Gutierrez is the sites adjacent or directly bordering the property and across the street. So the ones who are the most impacted by a project. So I too want to thank staff. We've done a great job, and we've come a long way in the approximate year since the report was released, or a little less than that. And we've made a lot of progress, shifting to online, a lot of services. And so it comes with a whole team out there doing an excellent job and changing the customer service aspect of it, so it is noticeable, and we're receiving more positive comments from the public as well, from some of the users. So definitely appreciate all the work you have. I don't have much more in addition to add to Councilmembers Jordan and Gutierrez, but I do agree with improving the signage to make it stand out, especially if there's a major decision coming, and bringing the major components of it in there so it doesn't get lost. And then I also support doing another round of mail noticing for the major decision point, in particular, the initial project design approval hearing. I think sometimes with a 9 months or even longer, you could people can move in and out of a neighborhood, so it would address those concerns, and it would just be notifying them at that specific time when they can appeal. But if it gets continued, the hearing were to get continued, it wouldn't require second noticing, just the first noticing, and make sure that they understand that this is the notice. The hearing could go multiple hearings, but this is the one that you really need to pay attention to and to get on the mailing list. And then also as part of it, during the actual hearings, make note of it, either in writing, in particular on the agendas, that this is an appealable hearing. If we could put it in the minutes, there was a discussion at council, although if you're relying on the minutes that come out, sometimes halfway through or later on during the appeal process, we should be doing that up front and not in the rears. But that did come up as council about the minutes reflecting an appeal. So if there are draft minutes that come out, say 3 or 4 days after a hearing, that it's in there as well. Just an extra ability to notice. And then I think we're on the right track for, I like the high impact projects that we're looking at for the reforms, improvements, and the time frame for those that we think we can get done in the next 6 to 9 months, and those that are going to take a year or so, maybe a little bit longer. But I like we're focusing on that. In particular, I'm interested in the issue of who has standing for the appeals, and then the narrowing of the scope. I think the example you used, Ms. Brooke, of maybe a pool or a deck, and then all of a sudden you have to go in and get a landscape plan for your whole property, I think is very salient and gets to the crux of the issue. Is you're coming in for one thing, and then all of a sudden you're opening up your whole property and a lot of additional expenses, especially when you're dealing with individuals that might be just coming in for one time, being like a homeowner that's coming in once every 10 or 20 years. And then the public workshop, agree with the strategy as well, doing the multiple outreach, including bilingual, that you have it on there, and reaching out individually and in groups and getting that feedback, and using online tools as well as personal contacts over a period of weeks. And then evaluating what comes up and what would be prevalent for a workshop, so that we can really focus that workshop, a public workshop, in the future. So with that, I don't have anything else, but just really appreciate all the work you and staff are doing, Ms. Brooke and Ms. Bjork, and close this item out. And then on to the last item is item D. The next meeting is September 29th, and is just to receive a report from the information gathered at the public workshop process. And is there anything else that we would be adding to that item, Ms. Brooke, for the next September 29th meeting?
Chair Friedman, we hadn't identified anything else, but if something comes up between now and September, we can run that by you and see if it's something that's timely for that September meeting.
Okay, and with that, nothing else on this agenda. So thank you for your work, and we're out of here a couple minutes before 12:30, right on time. So with that, this meeting is adjourned, and we'll see you all in September. Thank you.